Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Department of Medicine Grand Rounds. My name is Matt Winia. I direct the Center for Bioethics and Humanities, and I'm an internal medicine and infectious disease doctor. It is my pleasure today to introduce our visiting speaker for a very special lecture. Before I do that, though, I need to say a couple of recognitions. This special Grand Rounds is in honor of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which marks the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration and extermination camps in January of 1945, 81 years ago yesterday. Dr. Bayer's visit is sponsored by the CU Center for Bioethics and Humanities Holocaust, Genocide, and Contemporary Bioethics program, which was founded over 10 years ago with a generous initial gift from Dr. Bill Silvers, who's here with us today. It has since, by the way, been sustained by gifts from literally hundreds of additional supporters from around the world. I also want to thank the Center for Global Health at the School of Public Health and the leadership of Denver Health, both of whom have been important partners in developing the program for this visit. Bill Silvers has always encouraged our commemoration programs to explore not just history, but how history can help us understand and respond to events that are happening today. So these programs are dedicated to promoting education, scholarship, and community engagement on history. But they are also about asking tough questions about professional responsibility, about human rights, and about moral accountability in contemporary medicine. In our prior years' commemoration programs, we have explored the unique roles that medicine and science played in Nazi ideology and in the Holocaust itself. We've discussed how these atrocities in that era were not committed in isolation from our profession, but were often sadly developed and even led by health professionals operating in synchrony with the state and from leading positions within respected institutions. So this history demonstrates with devastating clarity how dangerous our profession can be when our power is separated from human rights, when groups are dehumanized and treated as biologically inferior, when science is allowed to eclipse the dignity and moral worth of individual lives. And remembering this history also reminds us that ethical failures aren't always sudden one-time events. They can emerge gradually through normalization, through the erosion of accountability, and through the erosion of science, and through silence in the face of corruption. So it is fitting that our speaker today is Dr. Chris Bayer, one of the world's leading voices in public health. His work, his voice, have consistently bridged rigorous science with ethical analysis and human rights advocacy. I've come to know Chris through our shared work on professional ethics, and we sit together on the International Advisory Council of Physicians for Human Rights. He is the Gary Hawk Distinguished Professor in Global Health and Professor of Medicine at Duke University School of Medicine. He also holds faculty appointments with the Duke Human Vaccine Institute, Johns Hopkins University, the University of Global Health Equity in Rwanda, from where, by the way, he is only today returned from Rwanda from the graduation of the first class of medical students at Paul Farmer's Medical School in Rwanda. Over his decades of work across multiple continents, including as president of the International AIDS Society, he has shaped global responses to HIV and AIDS and other infectious diseases while simultaneously advancing our understanding of human rights as fundamental determinants of health. History tells us that progress in health and human rights is not linear, and it is not guaranteed. Reversals can have devastating consequences. Dr. Bayer wrote what can only be called a haunting essay for The Lancet in the summer of this last summer called Ongoing Backwards. And this inspired us to invite him today to speak about ongoing backwards, historical perspectives, and ethical challenges in global health today. I have two pragmatic things before I turn the microphone to Chris. One, after today's grand rounds, I'll invite you to continue the conversation at a coffee connection and conversation opportunity right across the hall in it's in room A of the conference center, just outside the auditorium doors. This will be an informal opportunity to chat with Dr. Beyer. I also encourage you, if you can, to join us this evening at Denver Health for our community-facing event, What History Teaches Us About the State of Global Public Health, which will include a reception at 5 p.m., followed by a discussion between myself, Dr. Bob Belknap, who is here, there he is, from Denver Health, Public Health, this evening again at Denver Health. And if you want more information about that, it's on I believe it's on that QR code. Okay, with all of that as preface, please join me in welcoming warmly Dr. Chris Beyer.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much, Matt. How's the sound? Is it okay? Yeah, great. Wonderful to be with you all. And it feels very fortunate because that routing from Rwanda to Entebbe, Uganda, to Istanbul, to Denver had a lot of moving parts. and it worked out. So how wonderful. What I wanted to talk with you about today has really been the evolving story of what has been happening to global health, and particularly to the US share of the funding in global health, which has been the lion's share and which was halted, as you all are aware, very abruptly, starting January 20th of 2025. And I'm going to start largely by talking about funding, which may or may not seem like an ethical or human rights issue, but I hope in the course of this talk, I'll be able to share and show you that it is, in fact, profoundly an ethical and human rights issue. And it's important to understand, as we talk about that, just what a huge share of global health funding the US has been, and in particular had been leading up to January 20th of last year. These are my disclosures. Just to say, I still remain, it's obtuse to me how that could possibly be the case, a member of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief Scientific Advisory Board, and I remain on the WHO Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee for HIV, and on the Council for the NIH. All three of those entities have been profoundly at risk in this current period. So just to say, and I'll show you some of those data from the NIH, which many of you will also be, of course, familiar with. This is the outline for my talk today. I'm going to talk about global health funding through the end of 2024, then the policy and program changes since January of last year, the impact specifically on the NIH research agenda. I suspect that many of the people in this room and many of the folks listening online are NIH-funded investigators, and for all of us, this has been a very existential threat to our fields, our career, our work, our science. And then I'm going to share with you some recent narratives that were collected by Physicians for Human Rights in partnership with some academic partners from Tanzania and Uganda to really give you a more direct sense of what the impacts of these changes have been for people on the ground, both for providers, people living with HIV and TB, members of some of the most affected populations, sex workers, gay men, trans folks, and then take from that into really what is the human rights argument, which is based on the legal doctrine of legitimate expectation. And I'll go into some of that definition of what legitimate expectations are and why I think that this is really the crux of a human rights argument about what has happened to our field. So just to say, through 2023, this is all global funding for low and middle income countries in the health space. The US was far and away the largest donor. this is the US bullet here. We were over 40% of all funding in global health. You can see the second biggest donor was the UK, followed by Germany, Japan, France, and then a few others. All other donors, except for those major ones, accounting for only about 7%. So we were already the lion's share, and there was a vulnerability there because actually a number of the big donors, including the UK and Germany, have been decreasing their funding over time. So a big concern for us in the last 5 years or so was that the US was increasingly the last man standing funding in this area, and you never want to be in that position. But despite that very large commitment of money, it's a tiny share of the US federal budget, right? So there's the overall budget envelope through FY 2024, and we accounted for less than 0.1% of funding. That is a widely misunderstood figure. Americans overwhelmingly, in poll after poll, show that they think about 25% of the budget goes to low and middle income countries, and that is a failure on all of our part to communicate actually what a tiny proportion of the budget this is, despite how much money it is. This is what it looked like through the end of 2024. And as you can see, there has been a pretty stable funding from the US, around $12 billion a year, with the exceptions of that significant increase during COVID. And the previous blips that you can see there, one relates to Ebola. These are almost always in health security dollars. About half of all of that funding, this dark base of this figure, was in HIV. So when you look across the other areas, funding for the Global Fund, maternal child health, malaria, all the rest of it is about half of the money. HIV had an extraordinary lion's share, and that continues to be the case. So here's what it looks like in terms of dollars, that 12 billion or so in global health funding, about 5 billion or a little over 5 billion of it in HIV AIDS. And then you can see, for example, maternal child health getting a much smaller share of the pie, malaria, TB, neglected tropical diseases, a tiny slice, vulnerable children barely visible on this figure. And this is where it spreads out globally in terms of the countries. But very importantly, if you look at the top 10 recipients of global health funding for the US, this again is through 2023, you can see that it's concentrated in a relatively small number of African countries. All of those are the PEPFAR focused countries. People familiar with PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, that is the single largest commitment to a single disease by any government in history. Created by George W. Bush in 2003, approved repeatedly by the Congress. Last year, for the first time, not reauthorized for a 5-year reauthorization. And I just want to give you, I hope you can see the numbers here, the level of funding we're talking about. So Nigeria, 1 year of funding in Nigeria was $560 million. Right? That's over $500 million for that country. Nigeria is a big country. Tanzania is a big country, also over $500 million. But some of these countries, like Uganda and Zambia, are significantly smaller. Still, the burn rate of PEPFAR in Uganda since 2003, over $1 million a day. So just think about that. That is a lot of money, right? Accumulating over time. All the way down to the lowest figure here, which is Zimbabwe. But for example, Malawi getting $250 million a year. Malawi is a very small country, right? With quite a small population. So really an unprecedented level of investment. And hold on to those figures, because what we're talking about in terms of abrupt cessation is abrupt cessation of this level of funding, right? None of these countries could in any way be expected to immediately cover gaps of that scale. The US global funding by region, then because of PEPFAR and because of that huge focus on HIV/AIDS, telescopes down to 85% of it being in sub-Saharan Africa, right? So that is where the bulk of the money has been going, and it's been going there since 2003. Now, in science and in public health, there's a dictum that probably we should all be mindful of, which is you get what you pay for. right? So these are figures from UNAIDS, relatively recent, from 2012 to 2023, looking at the countries that either have stable, ongoing incidence or actually rising incidence, right? And none of these countries are in the PEPFAR focus areas. The one that keeps us up at night is the Philippines, which is where you can see actually rising HIV incidence over time, and that trend is continuing. So the places we did not invest in are really continuing to see rising epidemics. And that, of course, is true for some of the sub-epidemics underway in this country, like the one underway in Latino men who have sex with men, an expanding incidence epidemic. So that was then. This is now. What has happened since the inauguration? Well, the first thing, of course, was the immediate and abrupt cessation of all overseas development assistance, right, on the first day. And these are some quotes from folks in the PEPFAR program. This was from Nature, a PEPFAR-supported African investigator saying, "It is chaos." A perinatally infected adult outreach worker. So many of the people doing outreach work across the continent are in fact people living with HIV, right? Living with virus and on treatment. The way things are going, I feel like I've worked so much for nothing. Now, in the middle there is a photo that a friend sent me. So USAID was funding mobile testing centers. And of course, you know, Africa mostly is a hot, sunny place. And so these things have basically kind of tent coverings to keep people in the shade. Africans are nothing if not resilient. This one has been repurposed. All the USAID equipment was basically made available for sale, and it's being used to sell hats. So your taxpayer dollars at work. Now, I should just say, for those of you who are not familiar with the data, that before the PEPFAR program, this was leading up to 2003, we had this period that went on for many years, from 1996, when we developed HAART, highly effective antiretroviral therapy, until 2003, where people were doing great in the US and in other developed countries, and there was widespread death and devastation in the countries where the majority of people living with virus reside. We were seeing dramatic declines in life expectancy. Those of you familiar with demographics, a 30-year decline in life expectancy is something we have never seen before until this. It was so severe that it was affecting GDP, overall 2.6% annual declines in GDP across Africa, and 29 million, 30 million people living with virus with no access to care. Since PEPFAR, and that investment, by the way, is $110 billion up through 2024, 25 million lives saved, 20 million or so people on treatment, 5 million or more infants born HIV-free who otherwise would have been perinatally infected, and the return of GDP per capita in all of these countries. Africa now is one of the fastest growing continents. And this is, if you are not interested just in the argument about saving lives or preventing perinatal infections, the economic argument for this investment is also abundantly clear, right? From declining GDP to thriving economies, people working, going to school. This actually is a slide from the PEPFAR program itself. In 2024, they took on a modeling exercise. What would it look like? This was around the time of the reauthorization if PEPFAR was stopped. And what you can see is an immediate spike in AIDS mortality, followed by a return to orphans, because of course, so many of the people living with virus in Africa are reproductive age adults, and so many of them are parents. So this was a scenario that nobody expected to happen. I was actually at a National Academy of Medicine meeting just before the inauguration in early January, where all the former PEPFAR ambassadors and many of us on the advisory council were all together in DC at the National Academy talking about the future. What was it going to look like? No one, not a person in the room, predicted anything like what was to come. We were all way too optimistic about what was going to happen. Our group very quickly did one of the first modeling exercises to try and do projections on what this might look like. And this is just a projection really from the first few months of the year, looking forward to the first 12 months. So that would have ended in December. And what we projected was something like 100,000 lives lost and 135 perinatal transmissions, preventable perinatal transmissions. So it's 135,000 infants born with HIV. And Matt, in his very kind introduction, alluded to this piece that I wrote in The Lancet. That was inspired by this, because when I was on a Zoom call, you've all had this where, you know, the modelers are presenting their science, you're looking at the numbers. I saw this number of 135,000 perinatal transmissions, and I was right back in Brooklyn in medical school in the 80s when I took care of all of those infants and kids with untreatable HIV infection. And I can tell you it is a horrible way to die. And 100% of those kids died. And I was back there in such a profound way. I thought this cannot possibly be unfolding. And it has. And actually, these numbers have turned out to be much too conservative. And I'll show you some data to show that. The big impact also has been on prevention. I'll show you some data about what proportion of PrEP in particular, pre-exposure prophylaxis, globally has been supported by PEPFAR. But this is modeling just from the country of Eswatini and just looking at sex workers. And basically looking at new infections, the impact on an optimistic scenario, in the middle, a more pessimistic scenario, and then on the far side, the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is what has happened. When the PEPFAR program was stopped, all HIV prevention services were stopped for all populations except one. Anybody know who was allowed to still get PrEP? Uninfected, pregnant, and lactating mothers. That's it. It stopped for everybody else. So in fact, this was the worst case scenario. And then there was a piece in The Lancet. It's been quite an influential piece, controversial, as influential pieces often are, by Cavalcante et al. And this was trying to estimate the loss of life, not just from PEPFAR, but also from the elimination of USAID. The estimate is 14 million potentially all-age deaths up through 2030. The uncertainty interval there being the lowest estimate at over 8 million deaths, the highest being close to 20 million. So think about that in terms of some of the great crimes against humanity, right? Think about that in terms of the Holocaust. 8 to 20 million lives lost is an enormous loss of life, right? Now, it's not entirely clear how right or wrong those projections are. This assumes, for example, that host country governments are not going to step up, and many of them have. They've particularly been prioritizing keeping people on TB and HIV treatment. And of course, prioritizing saving life, which is an ethical imperative. What that also means, of course, is that prevention has gone off a cliff, as has HIV testing, TB testing and screening, malaria prevention, and so predictably, the treatment numbers are going to increase. But Brooke Nichols, who's an epidemiologist at Boston University, has stood up the PEPFAR tracker. I don't know how many of you are following that at all, but this has been trying to track losses of life. I updated this last week when I had some internet access in South Africa. So this is through January 20th. An estimate so far now of 240,000 adult deaths, preventable deaths, and 500,000 estimated childhood deaths, children under 5. Now that figure, I will tell you, has been going up much more rapidly than the adult deaths, and it's been going up much more rapidly in the last 3 months. And almost all of that, not all of it, but a very significant part of that recent deaths is malnutrition. 155,000 preventable losses of life from malnutrition. And I bring that up also because one of the things that is little appreciated is the fact that USAID has been the principal supplier of food, nutritional support for the now unprecedented number of displaced and refugee populations in the world. And there was an abrupt cessation of food aid. I was in Kenya over the summer. There were riots in some of the largest refugee camps in Africa because of the dramatic reductions in rations. So those numbers, I think, again, are likely to be very close to real. And that gives you a sense, just since January, 500,000 preventable child deaths. Now, Secretary Rubio, who now, by the way, is also the administrator of USAID and who oversees PEPFAR, which is not under HHS, it is under State Department. That was done deliberately by George Bush when it was created. Immediately put forward a waiver about 2 days after the abrupt cessation of aid because of the very loud advocacy cry and because of people saying, you simply cannot stop antiviral therapy without catastrophic impacts and, of course, without also increasing the grave concern we all have about resistance, including resistance with TB. So he put forward a waiver for life-saving programs. But it's very important to understand how these programs were administered and why this waiver has had such less impact than it should have. So how is PEPFAR? PEPFAR never had more than 100 employees in Washington, right? Despite giving out billions of dollars a year, it essentially functioned as a bank. The implementation of PEPFAR was done through USAID and through CDC, through HHS. But the other programs, for example, maternal child health, 100% implemented through AID. Global health security, 100%. Tuberculosis, 100%. Family planning, reproductive health, 99% through AID. Malaria, 96%. And then you can see the split with PEPFAR, with 60% AID and 37% through CDC and a few other entities within HHS. Only nutrition had sort of a more even distribution of funding. So what that meant was, despite the waiver, once USAID was gutted, and it is now, of course, completely destroyed and defunded, the actual ability for us to implement these programs vanished. And it made, of course, the waiver really a kind of Pyrrhic statement. But when I said I would talk a little bit about prevention and get back to that. What is not well appreciated is that PEPFAR, in addition to the treatment program, was far and away the largest funder of prevention, including pre-exposure prophylaxis. This is up through the end of 2024. 91% of all people initiated on PrEP globally were initiated through PEPFAR. How many of you knew that? I know there's a lot of smart public health people in the room. Yeah, no one. I didn't either. It really is very striking. And the reason that it's such a huge disproportionate number is because, of course, PEPFAR had implemented a program for prevention for adolescent girls and young women that was far and away the biggest prevention program we had. So let's talk about the NIH and some of the issues around funding, but also scientific integrity and academic freedom, which I think we also really have to pay attention to in this particular case. So this analysis I really quite like. This is from the New York Times. I hope that's projecting clearly. But what you can see is that there's a consistent pattern that federal funding for medical research does slow in the first year of a new administration, right? So you can see, for example, at the top there was a modest decline in Biden era funding. There was in the first Trump administration, even in the Obama administration. But the first year, and particularly the first 6 months of the second Trump administration, have been an extreme outlier. There has never been that kind of decline, so precipitous, so abrupt. And of course, there had not been, which there were in these cuts, also interventions in clinical trials. And when we think about particularly the bioethics issues with clinical trials funded by the US and other countries, the abrupt cessation of funding and the stop work orders for clinical trials is a violation of really all of our international agreements. It's a violation of Helsinki, right? It's a violation of the International Code of Harmonization. It's not clear that the administration even understood that USAID was funding clinical trials that involved human subjects. But for example, there was a very large trial of a vaginal ring, the dapivirine ring, and there were literally thousands of women with dapivirine rings in their vaginas who were abruptly stopped on this trial, right? That is, I think, about as severe a human rights and ethics violation as you can get. And there was a kind of strange array of topics that were suspended, right? This is the list of those topics. And it is, I think, about as idiosyncratic a list as you're going to come up with. First of all, of course, anything related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. You're all familiar with that. We're going to stop DEI. Second, anything relating to gender minorities, and particularly transgender health, because of course that came out in the executive order, presidential executive order saying that there were two sexes, male and female, and we were not going to fund anything related to trans health. 100% cessation of all funding to study vaccine hesitancy. Why would you want to stop that? Right? Because, of course, this administration is not interested in the causes of vaccine hesitancy. Sexual minorities and men who have sex with men were not included in the executive order, but nevertheless, as I'll show you, dramatic decreases in funding there. Cessation of all funding for mRNA vaccines. mRNA vaccines, I worked, full disclosure, for Operation Warp Speed on the COVID Vaccine Prevention Network and was an investigator on the mRNA vaccine trial, the Moderna trial. These were a spectacular scientific advance, right, that actually got us out of the COVID pandemic. Why would the US do this? And by the way, if you wanted to make our scientific competitors happy, it's hard to come up with a better policy than stopping all federal funding on mRNA, right? Including mRNA for cancer and other diseases. China, well, an abrupt cessation of US federal funding for research in China, and then of course climate change, and then specific universities, you all know the list, and then eventually another notice of a presidential decree about South Africa. No new grants or enrollments in clinical trials, and exclusion from the NIH-funded networks. Now, I mentioned the LGBTQ health. Only transgender health was in the executive order, but it turns out about 800 million overall was suspended across LGBT health, including, of course, for studies of HIV in men who have sex with men. In the US, men who have sex with men account for more than 2/3 of all new infections. So if you're not going to fund research on men who have sex with men, you're not going to do HIV research in this country, right? Everybody gets that. And then, of course, significant declines in the leadership, numbers of senior leaders leaving. And I have highlighted here in bold the women leaders who have been fired and lost their leadership positions in US science. And it has been really striking how few women leaders remain. And you will see a number of these folks are really some of our most important scientists in infectious diseases. Jeannie Marazzo, of course, the successor to Dr. Fauci. And then there was the executive order on South Africa. Addressing egregious actions of the Republic of South Africa was the title. Policy of the United States: as long as South Africa continues these unjust and immoral practices, the US will not continue. So what are those practices? What is this order about? This is about the issue of a purported genocide against white South Africans, against Afrikaner farmers. Now, this is fascinating, and it's important to note that where did this come from? Of course, there is no genocide against white South African farmers. And it turns out, this has been investigated, there's a great piece in The Atlantic about this, that this actually was a hallucination of the chatbot that underwrites Twitter. This is an actual AI hallucination. So instead of responding to real problems, we now have executive orders driving funding decisions based on an AI hallucination. I think that's the first time that an AI hallucinated genocide has driven policy for any government, actually. So we wanted to, as I said, collect data. PHR has led this effort. and put out a report relatively recently in September that got actually quite a lot of traction. PHR was able to take this to the Congress, both sides of the aisle. On the brink of catastrophe, U.S. foreign aid disruption to HIV services in Tanzania and Uganda. So these are the two countries where this data was collected. Overall, this was an oral history project, a multidisciplinary team looking at human rights, public health, HIV/AIDS. Data was collected, as I said, in Uganda and Tanzania in April. A wide array of people and stakeholders, and sampled through purposeful and snowball sampling. I won't spend too much more time on that. The overall findings really came out in 4 areas. One is that there was significant disruptions to HIV service delivery, particularly the loss of the peer and community outreach folks, and so many of the people doing adherence and retention support. Across Africa and across the PEPFAR program, many of these are folks living with HIV who have become peer counselors and peer supporters for their community. So there was an enormous loss of those folks. Severe impacts on individual and health-related decisions. So people, for example, skipping doses, hoarding their medication, increases in pediatric HIV infection, as I said, and a return of advanced HIV disease. But also some more qualitative aspects. One, a profound loss of trust, both in antivirals in the US government and in their home governments. This came up again and again. People felt that they really had a loss of trust. And then fear, depression, and anxiety, particularly among young people, the sense that they had had a future and had been told repeatedly, as long as you stay adherent and take your meds, you can continue education, you can get married, you can have children, you can live a full life, and suddenly feeling that their futures have gone dark. Just in the interest of time, I won't read too many of these specifically, but just to say this was a clinical officer in Uganda talking about basically what happened when their clinic was closed, and by the time it reopened, lost contact with many people. Again, an AIDS treatment director of an NGO in Uganda. I feel so bad. People were strong again, and now their lives are starting to decline. The children who grew up in our hands, who were brought to us close to death, and now we've grown them up. Some are in university, and really it's affecting us so much that we're going backwards. So this, I think, is about as painful an example of going backwards as you're going to see. Again, a clinical officer from Uganda, and in this case, relating to key populations, and people being told, for example, gay people or sex workers, you're not supposed to come here unless you want us to call the police. So what had happened in places like Uganda, where it's illegal to be a sex worker and it's illegal to be gay, is that the US funded clinics were providing services to those people. And now, of course, that collapsed. So this is one about the harms ahead. This is a doctor in a faith-based organization in Tanzania. We are worried that we should have done more to prepare for the 2030 goals. This was supposed to be to eliminate HIV as a public health threat. But if we ignore them and leave them behind, we are creating a lethal bomb in the future, not just for them, but also for organizations that are receiving funds to support key populations. They need to continue to be supported. And of course, this is an issue that the governments of these countries, many of them, are not going to support those programs. So the conclusions for this PHR investigation were there was an urgency to restore global health aid and in renewing PEPFAR, that even the brief disruption of the early period undermined essential health services and eroded trust, put lives at risk. And this very important finding that the long-standing commitments created legitimate expectations of continuity. Right? And the sudden termination without adequate notice foreseeably leads to loss of life. So we thought about this legitimate expectation quite a bit. And let me just say before I get into the human rights argument that this week, all of this is coming to a head, as many of you will know. Last week, the House approved a health spending bill that not only restored the same funding level for the NIH, as in the Biden era, but added about $400 million. So a modest increase, but nevertheless, but also a significant restoration of PEPFAR, not USAID, but PEPFAR, about $3.6 billion. So really very encouraging. That funding is now, of course, caught up in a political dynamic in the Senate. And we don't know if it's going to happen. And what had looked like a very unlikely government shutdown, as in this Friday, is now looking like a significant possibility again. So stay tuned. But just to say that encouragingly, I actually have something positive to say here, that we worked hard to get some accountability and to have Congress again express its authority over the PEPFAR program. And the current bill passed by the House prohibits the administration from deviating from the global health amounts spelled out in the bill. So that's really to protect it from Office of Management and Budget. There's reporting to Congress. There's a timeline on that reporting, and there is a transfer of some authorities that had been at USAID, now it's no longer there, to the State Department. So there are some real policy wins in this bill, and if it again passes the Senate and the president signs it, we will be in a much better place than we are right now. So what about legitimate expectations and accountability and the human rights situation here? So I thought about this quite a lot and published just last month in The Lancet a paper. The title is Legitimate Expectations and the Abrupt Cessation of U.S. Aid, the Human Rights Issue. And I'm happy to say that I'm not a human rights lawyer. I have no training in legal aspects of this, but I work closely with a longtime colleague and mentor, Joseph Goldstone. Some of you are Richard Goldstone. Many of you will know, South African High Court judge, was the chief judge for the Rwandan genocide and for the war crimes in the former Yugoslavia. So somebody who knows a lot more than I do about international human rights law, and he happily has signed off on this concept. So what is it? Basically, the doctrine is that there's a legitimate expectation when a public authority has made a promise or acted in terms of regular practice, such that the recipients, the constituents, have a legitimate expectation that that will continue. So this has been used a great deal in Commonwealth countries, and it's a big basis of Indian law, for example. We haven't used it as much in the US, but it is used, for example, in contract law in the US. So if you're signing a contract with somebody, and that contract, say, includes $10 million, you have a legitimate expectation that the person you're signing that with is doing this with good intent, and that if there is supposed to be $10 million, there really is. Right? That's a legitimate expectation. And if you think about it, it's the basis of a great deal of what we do in terms of all kinds of arrangements. The legitimate expectation in this case is that if you are, say, the Ministry of Health of Uganda, and you have been getting $1 million a day since 2003, and you are expecting that in your public health program budget, you are going to have for the next year, again, $400 million, for example, if that is suddenly stopped with no ability to negotiate, with no ability to say, can we carve out exemptions, right? With no time, by the way, to work on a national budget, that is a violation of legitimate expectation. And that is an impossibility for governments, particularly low-income governments, to address, right? So, the argument basically is that the abrupt cessation of assistance with no transition planning, no advance notification, and no opportunity for recipient countries to make cases for exceptions constitutes a grave violation of multiple countries' right to legitimate expectation. So when we looked at it from the other human rights treaties that are operative here, one that's very important is that the US, Tanzania, and Uganda, so these are the three countries that we're talking about in this investigation, all have obligations under the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, to avoid life-threatening harms, right? To not deliberately engage in policies that clearly will lead to the loss of life. So in the case of Uganda and Tanzania, their legitimate expectations were violated. In our case, the violation here is that anybody can tell you that if you abruptly stop support for HIV/AIDS programs, people will die, right? This is not a disease for which you can simply stop therapy today and restart when the funding comes back, right? That's not how it works. And the human rights argument is, of course, also that the people who made these decisions need to be held accountable. Now, Secretary Rubio has made multiple statements trying to avoid accountability and has said very clearly, no one has died due to these funding cuts. Right? He's on record as saying that in May of 2025. So that, of course, is something that can be investigated and interrogated. Is that true? Is that actually the case, or is it not the case? And I would argue, unfortunately, that it's abundantly clear by now that it is not the case, that no one has died because of these cuts, and that the way that they were handled deliberately imposed an extraordinary level of harm on these recipient countries and on these constituents. And so I think there is a human rights case to be made for accountability. It is long, right? The Rwandan genocide trials took almost 20 years. Same with former Yugoslavia. These are long processes, but nevertheless, I think it's extremely important to be collecting the data and the information such that these decision makers can be held accountable, and also that we really need to really take account of what has been done in our name. Right? These were programs supported by the taxpayers. Everybody in this room who pays taxes to the federal government has in one way or another supported these programs for many, many years. And their abrupt cessation really, I think in the human rights case, and we can make pretty clearly, was also an abrogation for all of us, right? And a profound one. So there are a number of people to acknowledge, and I'd like to do that before I close and then also open this up for conversation. I have to say that legitimate expectation is going to be a very high bar for any US courts. It also is going to be a challenge for international courts. And of course, the US is not signatory to a number of those international courts. And we actually right now have sanctions going against one of the most prominent ones. Imposed by this administration. So this is going to be a challenging human rights situation, but they all are. And there's no reason not, I think, to pay attention to accountability and to think about the meaning and understand the impacts of what it is that we've done. A number of people worked on this, a number of modelers, they're all there, Physicians for Human Rights, Richard Goldstone, again, I want to acknowledge Karen Namer, who's a fantastic human rights lawyer at PHR. All those data on funding are from the Kaiser Family Foundation, and Jen Cates, who leads that incredible program. And with that, I would like to say, I'm sorry if this is a challenging and difficult set of data, but I also think it's really imperative for all of us who work in global health to really understand what has happened, what the implications are, and how we're going to hopefully begin to turn this around and get out of this very challenging period. Thanks for your attention.
So we do have a few minutes for questions, and I expect there will be some, but I'm going to take the prerogative of asking the first. And I'll say I'm tempted first just to ask you sort of what gives you hope today, but I want to put that in historical context because this is our annual remembrance program, and the legacy of Nazism and the Holocaust weighs heavily in the creation of much of the human rights framework that we use today. And I'm wondering if you can, put into your answer about what gives you hope, something about lessons that we can take from coming out of World War II with a new set of understandings, and sort of what were the arguments that worked, right? Because I think you raised arguments related to economics, arguments related to morality, arguments related to politics and making friends and winning, influencing people. There are a number of ways you can sort of pitch human rights as being a benefit? What's going to work coming out of this era?
Well, I have to say, my answer is a little bit different today than it would have been last Friday, because one of the things that really gives me hope is how much traction there's been in the Congress on both sides of the aisle for global health funding. It really has been impressive. And first of all, the Global Fund replenishment that just happened in November. Global Fund is the second biggest area of funding. The administration, I think to many people's surprise, made a pledge of over $3 billion to the Global Fund replenishment, the largest for any country. So that was impressive, and it had bipartisan support. The funding for PEPFAR in the bill that passed the House last week, also substantial. It's a cut, but it's still around $3.6 billion. So far and away, the largest of any country contributing. So I think that is really hopeful. On the more human side of it, one of the things that we've seen repeatedly, including in Uganda, just give one example, are that a number of NGOs that abruptly lost their funding, people kept working without being paid. They felt so invested in this work. There's a limit to how much people can do that. Well, they're also trying to be breadwinners and support their families. But there's been a tremendous amount of solidarity there. And a number of governments, South Africa is prominently one, really have stepped up and tried to fill those gaps and provide for their citizens. There are plenty of others like Malawi that just simply don't have those resources. They're not going to be able to do it. But nevertheless, I think that's important.
I can keep asking questions, by the way.
Thanks for that talk, as sobering as it is. We talked earlier, and you mentioned that PEPFAR, if this goes through Congress as it was thought that it was going to, that PEPFAR is relatively restored. Can you comment on what's the impact of restoring PEPFAR in the face of destruction of USAID? Because the two really work in tandem in the wraparound nutritional services and everything else.
Yeah, so it will look very, very different. It's a great question. And as I said, it's not just PEPFAR, right? It's also that AID was the implementer of so many other programs, including maternal child health. I was just in August visiting Duke's collaborative sites on Madagascar. Madagascar's contraceptive program was 100% AID funded, and they literally are out of contraceptives. So, what is a modern country supposed to do, right, without contraceptives? So there's no question that that's going to be a huge change. The way the administration has been handling it is that each PEPFAR bilateral is being negotiated with the governments. And the idea is that USAID did so much through contractors, the FHI 360s of the world and all of those entities, Hop Council, JPIGO. Hopkins, by the way, my former employer, lost $800 million overnight because of basically two contracts, JPIGO and Center for Communications Program. So those bilaterals are being negotiated very directly, and they are meant to be directly with the governments. So there will be much less of basically the NGO interface, much less money coming to the US. That's something the administration feels very strongly about. They're challenging bilaterals right now because what they have insisted on, first of all, is that the countries report their data to the US, fair enough, we're paying, and to no one else, including WHO. And the same with specimens. The specimens, which of course are the real interests of pharma, are to be shared only with the US, not with WHO, not with the Africa CDC. So many governments are balking at that, not surprisingly. In the African political space, it's been a very, I think, remarkable series of conversations. Many governments are saying that these cuts, this change, is the opportunity for them to reassert national sovereignty over their health systems, over their data. That has been a very compelling argument. And Africa CDC has kind of led that discussion. And there is a case to be made there. There certainly is. But with the way the PEPFAR bilaterals are being negotiated right now, it undermines that. right, immediately. So we want your data, we want your specimens, and you can't talk to WHO or the other players. So, so far, anyway, I think those have been really challenging, and a number of the deals that governments signed, once civil society found out what had been agreed to, the governments had to backtrack. That's happened in several countries. So it's very much in play. The new PEPFAR language is that's in the bill is significantly better, and as I said, it also has congressional oversight. There was no congressional oversight in these bilaterals at all. The Congress essentially had no role to play. And obviously, you know, if the Congress has the power of the purse, and these are taxpayer dollars, there has to be congressional oversight and there has to be reporting. And in the past, PEPFAR was known, particularly it was true under many leaders, but particularly Ambassador Debbie Birx, when she was running it, was very heavily data-driven and was regularly reporting to the Congress. The same was true when Eric Gooseby, some of you will know, was the PEPFAR ambassador. I was on his scientific advisory board, and it was relentless focus on, you know, collecting the data and reporting it to the Congress. And that's the way it should be, right? There should be accountability for, particularly when you're spending that much money, right? I mean, it is substantial, despite being such a small slice of the pie.
So I was surprised by the dominance of U.S. funding for international development that you showed. And so now that we've created a vacuum, is there any sense that other developed nations will step in to fill it? And is the infrastructure of international aid such that that would be problematic, where you have a diversity of funders rather than a single one?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's not just the dollar amounts, it's also differences in what the donors want to fund. So for example, the EU has been a significant donor. They have not wanted to fund these vertical programs like PEPFAR focused on HIV or the Global Fund with AIDS, TB, and malaria. They really want to fund health system strengthening. And so that's going to be more prominent, certainly, in the funding going forward. With the Global Fund replenishment, the biggest donor after us was the Germans, and that has been the case for several years, and they did up their contribution. Canada has also appeared to do that. But it's also not just governments. So for example, we pulled significant amount of funding from Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, and that the Gates Foundation has stepped in and tried to fill that gap. They can't obviously do that on the scale that I showed you, and they can't do it everywhere, but they're going to do it for immunizations. So that also is happening. But the second biggest donor for the last 20 years has been the UK. And post-Brexit, they have really dropped out of that. They actually closed DFID, right, their development funding, as did the Australians. AusAid is gone, right? They've ceased to fund that. And I think if you sort of look at where we are in terms of global solidarity, you know, and the idea that all of the wealthy countries are going to pitch in and solve what was called the problem of the bottom billionth, you know, the poorest of humanity living, you know, less than $2 a day. That consensus, I think, is deeply threatened.
I'm given that this is the Holocaust, you know, genocide, contemporary bioethics. And speaking of contemporary bioethics, I know that Israel has participated in the African continent, you know, in terms of their medical infrastructure for many years, you know, trying to, you know, to perhaps be a light unto the nations as they put emergency hospitals in, you know, conflict zones. You know, the question is, you know, relative to the other person who commented, you know, Israel has done this, you know, in many respects for bioethics and for, you know, its support among the non-developed countries in Africa. Has China, who has, you know, had, you know, many infrastructure projects, has China, Russia, Iran participated at all, in terms of trying to get in where the United States is getting out?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I think some years ago, there was significant sort of engagement with China around picking up in some ways and doing this. And I think it was the last year of the Obama administration, the president was making a major announcement about the increase in PEPFAR and in the Global Fund, and invited the Chinese leadership to also step up and do the same thing. So Obama made a pledge that was in the many billions of dollars, and the Chinese pledge was 18.5 million. And it was just abundantly clear that nobody had briefed them on how terrible that was going to look, right? And it was sort of a shocker in the room when it was announced, and they were waiting for applause, and obviously there was none. So what we understand, and there's a number of Chinese leaders who've spoken about this on and off the record, is essentially that they feel that this area of overseas development assistance in health is something that the West, particularly the US, the UK, and other Western powers have led. And so they are not interested in stepping into that. They don't want to follow in that. And their approach is very different. And it has been essentially infrastructure development, roads, bridges, ports, a whole array of other activities that they argue will lift people out of poverty and will have big impacts on health through that mechanism. And China, has lifted more people out of abject poverty than any other country in the world. It's 800 million people since Deng Xiaoping's open door policy. So they have a case to make there, that they have done that. We'll have to see. For many of these African countries, they now are saddled with a new problem, which is that they owe China a great deal of money for these infrastructure projects, and they are now saddled with servicing debt. And their argument about not being able to pick up where the US has dropped off in terms of PEPFAR and the Global Fund in many countries is, 60% of our GDP services debt. And this is why Jim Kim, former president of the World Bank, and others have been making the case that if you really want to do health relief that will have impacts on the continent and elsewhere, debt relief has to be a part of it. That is a very important part. So we'll see. In terms of Russia, absolutely not. They're not interested in this area, but they are very active on the continent. And they have financed 3 coups. There's now this coup belt in West Africa. So you can look at Burkina Faso and Mali and get a sense of what it looks like when the Russians have done that. And for the most part, it's security. They, security for the people who've led the coups. They put a lot of money into that. Weapons and extraction of rare earths and minerals. That seems to be their policy focus.
Thank you so much. We're a couple minutes over. If folks want to continue the conversation, we'll be gathering in room A right across the hall. Thank you for being here today.